Section 4.3 also has two more postulates to show how triangles can be congruent. The first one is angle side angle. So you have two angles and the included side of one triangle congruent to two angles and the included side of another triangle, then you know those two triangles are congruent. So notice the key words. I have two pairs of angles that are congruent, but the side that's congruent has to be in between the two angles that are congruent. Let's take a look at the first example. It asks, what two triangles are congruent by angle side angle? And here are your three triangles. So this one here, I have angle side angle, so it goes in that order. This one has angle side angle. This one has angle angle side. So notice that this one would not work because this side has to be in between the two angles that are included. So I would say triangle UVS is congruent to triangle EON, and it's very important when you're writing these out that you match up the corresponding parts. So notice that I matched up U with E because they had one arc. I matched up V with O because those had two arcs, and then obviously S and N. Alright, pause the video and try the next one. Which two triangles are congruent by angle side angle? So I see angle side angle, I see side angle angle, and then I see angle side angle. So it has to be the first and the third. So then matching those up, you would want to make sure that you write G matched up with C, and H matched up with A, and O matched up with T. So I wrote it as triangle GHO congruent to triangle CAT. Now be aware that's not the only way to write it. Just make sure that your corresponding angles match up with each other. Alright. The second postulate is angle angle side. So that means two angles and a non-included side of one triangle are congruent to two angles and the corresponding non-included side of another, so then you know the triangles are congruent. So what that means is we are no longer looking at an included side. Okay, so this side that's congruent is not in between these two angles. That's the important part. So notice that it goes in order: angle, angle, side, angle, angle, side. Okay, so you can just read on there what it's saying. Okay, so let's look at a proof here because you're going to have some of those on this section. So it gives me M and K are congruent, and it also tells me that WM is parallel to RK. So the first thing I would write down is that given part. Okay? Remember, I'm trying to show these triangles are congruent. So now in my pocket I have four different theorems or postulates. I have side side side, I have side angle side, I have angle side angle, and angle angle side. So I'm going to start looking for stuff that I know is congruent. Well, every time when you're doing these triangles, if you see butted up triangles, you want to make sure you mention that. So the first thing I wrote down is that WR is congruent to itself, and again, that's the reflexive property. Alright, so then the next thing I'm going to look for is, why would they tell me that WM is parallel to KR? There must be some kind of reason. So when I think of parallel lines, I automatically start thinking about corresponding angles, same side interior, alternate exterior. So if these two are my parallel lines, and I think of this as my transversal, anything inside of here is going to be interior. So if I have alternate interior angles, those have to be congruent to each other. So that's the next thing that I wrote down. I wrote down angle MRW is congruent to RWK, and that's by the alternate interior angles theorem. Now, look to see what I have. I have an angle, and a side. And then on the other one I have an angle, and a side. So therefore, these two triangles have to be congruent to each other by the angle, side theorem. Alright. Let's take a look at the next here. Use the diagram at the right. Which of the following statements best represents the answer and justification? Is these triangles going to be congruent? Yes, the triangles are congruent. No, they're not. Yes, the triangles are congruent. No, they're not. So looking over here, what I see is I have two angles congruent to each other, and I have two sides. Now, the tricky part is if I'm doing angle, angle, side, remember that it has to be the corresponding part. So in order for this side to match up, it would have to be congruent to that side UO. And since it's not matching up, my answer is no, they're not congruent because those two sides are not corresponding. It looks by the picture that it could be angle, angle, side, but you have to pay attention to make sure that it's the corresponding side. Alright, you're going to pause the video and try the last question. So in the last question, it asks if those triangles are congruent. I have a pair of angles congruent and a pair of sides. I look and I notice that I have vertical angles here, so I know these two angles are going to be congruent. So now I have angle, angle, side. Angle, angle, side. So therefore, these triangles are congruent by angle, angle, side. And then I just listed out what was congruent. A is congruent to I, PR is congruent to RS, and then PRA and IRS are congruent by the vertical angles theorem. So what you're going to notice with this worksheet is that you do have proofs, but it has to match one of the theorems. So you know that you're either looking for three sides congruent, angle, angle, side congruent, angle, side, angle, or you're looking for angle, angle, side. So trying to pay attention to which piece that it will match up with.